Tonight, you're not watching London under fog. You're watching it under something thicker. Before you fall asleep, you'll walk through a summer that put a whole city in a jar, stand by a river that stopped moving but wouldn't stop breathing, and see how one unbearable smell pushed Parliament to hold its nose and finally changed the way a capital handles its own past. A pane of hot glass hums softly, keeping the day's heat like a secret. Outside, the Thames exhales. The air that comes in through the sash feels like someone opened an oven where a river should be. Ink dries too fast on a clerk's desk. He fans the air with a folded bill, discovering that money is good for at least one honest thing. Curtains hang limp, painted to the frame by warmth and a faint brown insistence. The city sounds normal wheels, hooves, voices, but underneath, every street is holding its breath. If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and what time you're listening from, perhaps the next slow sigh of the river will remember you there, half awake, while London learns that some problems arrive by nose first. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a law or a blueprint. It begins when the water is too hot to ignore. You might not think a hot river could hold a city by the nose, but London learned that a summer can be surprisingly persuasive. The air sits down and refuses to leave. Windows sag open like tired eyelids. Clerks tap the edges of their desks as if a gentle rhythm might waft the smell elsewhere, maybe into the hallway, maybe into someone else's problem. The Thames looks thick but moves like an exhausted cat, lifting a paw and deciding against it. Barges sit in a brown, contemplative line, as if moored to the mud with invisible nails. On the embankments, boys try to skip stones and discover you cannot skip soup. It is the season of curtains that stick to paint, of handkerchiefs promoted to the rank of armor, and of people who learn strange new routes through the city just to avoid certain breezes. Heat is a slow kind of politics, and the river attends every meeting. Each drop has a biography. Breakfast runs down scullery pipes after giving up on the toast. The water in a privy hears a bell and moves downstairs to greet the drain. In 1,000 yards of brickwork, the city murmurs to itself from sink to trapdoor to gutter, from gutter to tide and back again to the tap, with a certain circular optimism one would call charming if it were not so aromatic. Convenience pours eagerly into sewers too narrow to deserve the plural. The old cesspits are capped with a feeling of triumph, like closets reorganized and then filled immediately with the same old coats. When the tide comes in, the river's chest swells. When the tide sits down, the smell stands up. Miasma theorists feel vindicated. This surely is disease. Fully dressed and out for a stroll, and they carry scented handkerchiefs the way a knight carries a shield, pleats facing outward. Trained noses distinguish notes the way a music teacher marks time. A bright high tone near the slaughterhouses, a dull lower register by the tanneries. A curious midrange near the breweries where waste meets yeast and discusses the future. At night, lamps come on and convert darkness into an honest list of what the day has done. The river does not move. It exudes. A pane of hot glass collects dust that was once rain. The clerk folds a bill into a fan and learns why paper money exists. People speak softly, not to be heard by the water. The street above is only the city's first draft. Beneath it runs a second, more private manuscript, written in brick and damp. Long before the great summer, there were drains for storms, fast lanes for clouds. The rain arrived, chattered down, and left. Then the city multiplied itself, as cities do when wages promise bread and maybe a little meat, and people discovered that storm drains are excellent listeners. Night soil men who had once lifted certain buckets with solemn dignity retired early, defeated by a new fashion for having waste disappear as neatly as a coin in a conjurer's hand. Basements learned a different language. When it rained, brown handwriting bloomed on the bricks. Floodlines traced the memory of every heavy afternoon. Rats, who were fluent in infrastructure, added side comments in the margins. The river under the streets ripened in silence. On hand-drawn maps, outbreaks of cholera made constellations, tiny Orion belts of grief that pointed from pump to pump, as if the heavens had decided to correspond with the city and had chosen a damp, heartbreaking script. In that soft noise of pipes and guesses, a quiet engineer unfolded a plan large enough to stand on. He looked at the city and decided that, like a good coat, it needed lining and strong seams. Interceptor sewers, he said, would steal the filth before the river could drink it, catch it, carry it, and escort it to the sea with the discretion of a well-bred porter. He worked with something like a rule of two: build once for today, and once more for the tomorrow that always arrives with friends. If a pipe would do, use two. If a wall would hold, thicken it as if the future were heavier than it looks. The pencil moved, and the Thames acquired tact. New embankments would edge the water like patient hands smoothing a bedsheet. The river would keep its room, and the city would keep its socks dry. The engineer's handwriting was as tidy as a hymn. The drawings suggested that the solution to smell was not perfume, nor even scolding, but geometry and persistence. Brick after brick, the city would learn to tuck its refuse into corridors that led away from its appetite and toward the open, salted mouth of the sea. Up by Westminster, Heat leaned over the windowsills and listened to the debates the way a neighbor listens to gossip, with interest and without permission. Clerks, who had been instructed by their noses that philosophy was now practical, soaked curtains in carbolic and draped them like sleepy flags. Members dabbed their upper lips and developed new talents for brevity. The speeches had a brisk, nasal clarity, as if each sentence feared to be caught in place and therefore made itself short. Some jested quickly. Then everyone stopped jesting quickly. Lime appeared on the stone like a sprinkling of pale advice. A window opened after a storm, figuratively, of course, because the real windows stayed as shut as decency allowed, and through it walked a vote. The Thames was granted a new title, something to do with openness in sewers, and while dignity suffered slightly in the phrasing, sanitation prospered. Up in the galleries, an observer could have traced the argument's path from nose to ledger, from ledger to law, and finally to the men who actually lay brick for a living, which is the parliamentary version of sunrise. Money, which prides itself on being scentless, discovered it had nostrils after all. Rates went up, letters scolded. Newspapers rolled their eyes and then bought extra sheets because readers cannot resist a scandal with such practical consequences. In the yards, brickmakers' hands turned the same color as their product. On the river, navvies shouldered the ground itself, heaving out clay as if rearranging the city's organs for better breathing. Contracts marched from dusk to dusk like small platoons. They reached the tunneling crews who looked up at arches under construction and saw, quite literally, the future framed. When the first stretch of new work closed with the final keystone tap, the city felt the click in its bones the way a person feels a door latch at night. Ah, there we are. The summer still smelled, but hope acquired an address. Downstream, and in the marshier margins of memory, the city began to raise cathedrals with no pews. Abbey Mills, with its turreted machinery, breathed steadily like a congregation of sleeping engines. Iron ribs arched across pumping halls, and brick patterns stacked themselves into a polite, repetitive prayer. Lift, push, send. Lift, push, send. The buildings looked paradoxically clean for places that lived among filth, just as a baker's apron is somehow always white when viewed from the street. Outfalls carried the water's old stories away. The river above them practiced forgetting. On maps, those little constellations of sickness dimmed, as if the night sky had grown bored of tragedy and tried a quieter motif. Miasma, that grand theory with a flair for drama, slipped into retirement without writing a farewell speech. Germs would earn the credit later. For now, the practical effect was that breath became less adventurous, and walking by the river lost a little of its plot. There's an oath here, but it is comfortable and domestic. Infrastructure is public health with its hat off, hosting the neighborhood with teapots and a good mop. Bazoljat's twofold habit build for now and then again for later saves. Future citizens from choices they will not remember to thank him for. The embankments give London a spine and a sort of posture lesson. The city feels taller, the way one does when a tailor finally returns a jacket that actually fits. Keep storm and sewer apart the way you keep your diaries in separate drawers. Never drink your past. Fold your curtains at night. It's practical poetry, and it receives fewer applauses than it deserves because the audience is busy not being ill. By twilight, the river turns quietly under the moon, practicing a new, nearly inaudible music water over outfall, a soft industrial hymn. Notice how he, that reluctant performer, steps back from center stage once the pipes begin to hum. Streets cool just enough to stop shimmering. The fan on the clerk's desk becomes less of a survival tool and more of a nervous habit. Ink dares to remain liquid until the workday ends. Along the embankments, Londoners practice the luxury of ignoring their own river, which is one definition of civic success. The smell does not announce itself any longer. It writes polite notes and leaves them by the door, a courtesy no one returns. Barges move again, though not quickly, because no one changes temples overnight. The city transitions from defending itself with handkerchiefs to defending itself with plans, a more restful kind of courage. The new tunnels make their own weather. Inside it is cool and echoing, a sound like distant boots stepping in step. The brick curves shine a little with moisture, as if someone had oiled the inside of a seashell. Workers swap stories about how hard the clay was in one place and how helpful the chalk was in another. Stories with the gentle, repetitive shape of lullabies. Every few yards, a lamp shows the next few yards, and no more, which feels honest. The river above, not required to be every drain's mother, narrows into itself and regains the old rhythm of water that is chiefly water. You can stand on the embankment in the evening and feel a breeze that comes from somewhere else, and you can tell the difference. The city's shoulders drop a fraction. The nose, that reliable parliamentarian, adjourns. In the public parks, the grass learns to be merely grass. Children develop the minor but precious talent of not noticing smell, which frees them for better games. A physician with a notebook looks at the cholera map and sees fewer stars. He makes a small dot anyway because habit is the last disease. On the bridges, night walkers exchange little observations. The light is different. The water looks higher. The air seems plain in the best possible way. Plain air is an achievement. When you live near a river, you start to recognize its moods the way you recognize a friend's voice on a foggy day. The Thames, after that summer, speaks in a lower register, mellowed by brick and disciplined by valves. Its breath still smells of tides, of ships, of distant coasts, but not of yesterday's dinner. In certain weathers, you can fancy that you hear the pumps turning over, a calm heartbeat under the city's more excitable noises. The engines at Abbey Mills seem to sleep with one eye open, like watchful grandparents. London learns to count differently. Instead of tallying complaints, it begins to count arches finished, pipes joined, basins emptied on purpose and not by accident. The great lesson is not that smell is unpleasant. The city already knew that, but that convenience is an engineer with a memory. You may close a cesspit, yet it continues in spirit if the waste still wanders home by another route. You must give it a carriage and a timetable. The lesson is also that public works are precisely that, works for the public, including noses, lungs, and the general desire to sleep with the window a little bit open. There is a municipal tenderness to it, a kindness expressed in gradients. By now, perhaps the edges of these words are soft. We can let them smudge. The clerk folds his fan and learns again how to write a sentence without waving it dry. The handkerchief slides back into the pocket, demoted to its former career of being politely decorative. The summer of the Great Smell becomes a bedtime story for the pipes. Once upon a tide, a river sat down and the city stood up. But there was no moral, only masonry and patience, which is an even better bedtime ending. Heat leaves like a guest who forgot his hat and will return briefly tomorrow at noon. The tide taps the stairs and retreats. The map of the city looks unchanged, but beneath the lines, the new river moves where it should, and the old one has enough room to be what rivers are when no one bothers them. If you trace the embankment with your finger on a page, you can feel none of this, of course. Paper is immune to odor and indifferent to pumps. Yet somewhere below streets with ordinary names, along tunnels measured with sleepy exactness, waters traveling by appointment, the city exhales more quietly. Tonight you can close the sash, or leave it ajar if you like a hint of tide in your dreams. Somewhere a brick is drying. Somewhere else a valve is turning like a yawn. The Thames, patient at last, turns under the moon and says almost nothing at all. You might not expect a painted wooden ball to keep the world punctual, but for a long, drowsy while, a single sphere on a London hill did exactly that. It is red, because red is easy to see when your ship's deck won't stop moving. It is about as wide as a tall child laid sideways. It rides up the mast on the roof of the Royal Observatory at Greenwich. Then, at exactly 1 p.m, it lets go of the day and drops. Captains look up from the Thames, clerks pause at windows. Pocket watches feel suddenly self-conscious. A quiet city calibrates itself because a ball remembers to fall. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe to more stories about patient objects. Or don't, the ball will drop either way, and I promise not to be offended. Before the ball, time was a neighborhood habit. Each town let the noon sun pick a favorite steeple, and that steeple told everyone else when to have lunch. Bristol was sometimes 10 minutes slow compared with London, which was a charming eccentricity until trains began insisting on not colliding. The railways invented railway time, which sounds like a holiday but was mostly an attempt to agree on minutes before the minutes misbehaved at high speed. Port cities had their own problem. A ship's chronometer is a small, expensive promise. It tells you longitude if it tells you the right time, and longitude is the difference between arriving at a harbor and discovering you have invited yourself to a reef. Chronometers, like cats, distrust changes in temperature, humidity, and attention. They want steady hands. They want reassurance. They want 1 o'clock that is unquestionably 1 o'clock. So the observatory offered a ritual: hoist the red ball at 5 minutes to 1, raise it to the top. At 2 minutes to 1, let it sit there, like a held breath, and then precisely at 1 release it. No trumpet. Just gravity doing what gravity does with good manners. The drop wasn't for Londoners who were guessing their supper. It was for those who needed seconds to behave. Shipmasters anchored in the Thames pointed telescopes at the roofline. On clear days, they set their chronometers with a little smile that meant tomorrow. Noon on the Atlantic would be almost the same noon as the one on Greenwich Hill. On foggy days, they shrugged, trusted yesterday's setting, and ordered more tea. In calm weather, boys in parks practiced counting 1 Mississippi and discovered the Mississippi was not required. The time ball had cousins. Once the idea proved unexcitingly brilliant, other ports asked for their own. Portsmouth had one. Deal had one. Liverpool had one that learned to talk to the railway telegraph so it could fall at the same moment as Greenwich without developing an inconvenient personality. New York tried one at the Western Union Building. Women with parasols and men with hats gathered to watch a carefully planned surrender to gravity become a daily entertainment. In an age that loved ceremony, here was a ceremony so modest you could mistake it for weather. A thing went up, and later it came down, and yet mariners sailed straighter because of the coming down. Telegraph wires crept through the hedgerows and along the rail cuts like shy metal vines, and time learned to travel without a coach. Greenwich sent electric pulses outward clicks, really. Little taps on the knuckle of the nation so that railway stations could move their hands together like a well-rehearsed chorus. In small towns, station masters walked across the platform with keys that would lock the clock's face briefly at the top of the minute, convincing it to be exactly right under protest. In big stations, an operator with a calm mustache watched a needle quiver and leaned forward to listen to seconds he could almost hear. At sea, a captain who had missed the ball last Thursday might receive a news setting by signal at Dover or St. Catharines, and he stowed the knowledge in brass like a biscuit in a tin. It is the quietest revolution. Calendars do not change. Kings do not flee. Nobody has to storm anything except the occasional English sky. But when you coordinate clocks, you unwrinkle habits. A letter posted from York spends fewer unscheduled hours doing nothing in a sack. A factory whistle at 6 actually means 6. Newspapers catch the eager train because both ends of the platform agree what 5 minutes to departure intends. Lovers become late on purpose rather than by geography. The public learns what a minute can do and begins to complain about them with new accuracy. If you compare this to a modern social network, it isn't wrong. It's just slower, safer, and largely free of opinions. The ball itself is unromantic about its employment. Each morning, a keeper checks the rope and the mast and the battered paint. There is a little winch. There is a practice drop around 10, just to let everyone feel the muscle memory of the day. Someone notes the difference between Greenwich Mean Time, which is the average sun, and the apparent sun, which is the fickle real one wandering around the equation of time as if looking for misplaced spectacles. There is also a small conversation about weather. Wind makes everything opinionated. Fog is an anti-television. Still, as long as the mechanism can be coaxed, the ball will go up on the quarter hour and again at 2 minutes to 1, and then fall. The Board of Longitude would approve in spirit. Longitude loves routine. There is a pleasing thrift in how the observatory used the same few pieces of wood and iron to persuade Britain as clocks. The ball is not heavy by the heroic standards of monuments, but it is heavy enough to be convincing. It slides in guides. The mast is tall enough that the top position is clear against the sky, and the drop, even for a distracted captain, is unmistakably now. In winter, the red paint goes dark, and the ball looks like a careful punctuation mark at the end of a gray sentence. In summer, it's a tomato thrown at the sun by someone polite. Occasionally, the rope snaps, which is more exciting for the rope than for anyone else. People write letters saying the ball fell late. The letters are answered with patient notes, citing the chronometer and the transit instrument. Time inspires correspondence as if time were a relative who insists on exact birthdays. You could say that the time ball turned a hill into a lighthouse for clocks. It warned no ships away from rocks. It warned their seconds away from carelessness. An observatory transit instrument pointed at a star and told the keeper when the Earth had carried London under it. From that, 1 o'clock was extracted and prepared like a simple meal. The telegraph lines carried this meal to stations along the rails, and the rails carried it further as schedules. A schedule is a very long, flat kind of time ball. At first, towns held out for local noon. Then they conceded in the interest of not causing trains to argue with each other at junctions. Parliament eventually declared that Greenwich would be the national standard, which is the pragmatic version of romance. Pocket watches learned discipline. Before the ball, a watch was a private hunch with a spring. After the ball, it had to pass small public tests. A gentleman could no longer wave his arm vaguely at the afternoon and say he had been delayed by the sun. If his watch said 12:58 and the ball was already falling, the watch, not the universe, had some explaining to do. Shops offered Greenwich time corrected here, which meant a boy had been sent to look at the ball and come back in a manner as prompt as he could manage. Postal carriers developed a reputation for being as regular as gravity because a nation full of corrected watches noticed when they weren't, T. The difference between 12:59 and 1 o'clock became the difference between almost and actually. Some ships missed the ball entirely when fog crawled across the river like a sleepy cat. For them, auxiliary signals were added. A time gun boomed from the battery, a polite explosion informing the harbor that one had arrived, whether or not it could be seen. People living nearby grew fond of the sound the way one grows fond of a kettle that always boils on time. On certain holidays, the ball was allowed a rest, and letters arrived asking whether time had also taken the day off. It hadn't, but it could be forgiven for wanting one. The ball belongs to a larger movement of tidying. Along with standard gauges for the width of rails and standards for screw threads and tables of weights and measures that made a pound in York equal to a pound in Plymouth, standardized minutes make cooperation less theatrical. Engineers who built the first transatlantic cable published the exact second they started, and the exact second the first message emerged at the other end. And it mattered that both seconds meant the same thing. Astronomers compared eclipses. Telegraphers synchronized relays. In offices, clerks acquired a new game, adjusting wall clocks with small brass keys while pretending this was art. It is tempting to look back and say the ball was quaint, but that is only because it worked. The early time balls let a captain sail out into weather and still carry Greenwich under a glass. The later electric impulses poured that steadiness into stations and factories until Greenwich Mean Time meant less the hill and more the habit. Eventually the radio spoke. The voice said, at the third stroke, it will be, and a tone pip-pip-pipped into living rooms where cats listened with evident respect. Later still, satellites taught phones to consult skyborne clocks that are so consistent they would become bored if they were people. A pocket now adjusts itself when the plane lands. The ball drops anyway, because it is polite to keep promises after you become redundant. There is one more quiet thing the ritual teaches. When you raise the ball to the top of the mast and you hold it, everyone gets to practice waiting. Waiting is underrated engineering. 2 minutes to 1, the wind fusses with jackets on the hill. 1 minute to 1, someone farther down on the river clears his throat. 10 seconds to 1, an operator's finger rests their handle. The last second hinges and the ball agrees with the earth. Down. It lasts only a blink. But for that blink, hundreds of small mechanisms, the escapement in a marine chronometer, the balance in a lady's watch, the electric contacts in a signal box find themselves in conversation with a painted sphere. You might be wondering whether people clapped. Sometimes they did, and then, once the novelty had pleased itself, they didn't. The point of the ball was not applause. It was the ordinary miracle that noon can be a promise, that longitude can be a number rather than a rumor, that a city by a river can coordinate its departures without telling dramatic stories about the sun. Even now, at 1 in the afternoon, tourists look up and see a little red circle hover and fall, and they take pictures of it with phones that listen to atomic seconds humming far overhead. The pictures are usually a fraction too late. That is traditional and right. It is easy to fall asleep to such a device. You imagine the keeper winding the winch with a practiced hand. You imagine the mast ropes slightly sticky from weather. You imagine shipmasters in the Thames with telescopes like modest cannons and watches open like flowers. You picture telegraph wires humming to themselves about minutes, and station masters locking clock faces for a breath as the pulse passes. You see a map of Britain with invisible threads of time pulling taut from Greenwich outward, tidy, unheroic, kind. The ball still drops. On some days, the wind wiggles it. On others, the sky is so clean that the red looks freshly washed. People check their phones against it for sport, and the phones win, but the ball never seems insulted. The mechanism slows, releases, and the sphere slides down in a way that remains satisfying to parts of the brain that enjoy fruit falling from trees. If you stand there, you will find yourself counting without deciding to count. The hill breathes. The river changes its mind. Someone coughs around the second pip, and then a measured hush. Eventually, in the museum nearby, you notice a row of chronometers in glass cases, each one ticking with the confident shyness of machines that have earned their sleep. Brass glows. Balance wheels wag their small polished heads. A label explains how errors creep and how to persuade them to creep more slowly, which is the essence of navigation and possibly of living. The ball outside continues its one-trick career. It knows nothing of labels. It keeps the appointment and moves on. So you might not expect a painted sphere to hold together trains, letters, tides, and schedules. Yet for decades, an afternoon drop taught a nation how to agree, and the habit has not fully left us even as we consult louder satellites. If tonight you wake and wonder what time it is, your clock will tell you with a confidence that started on a roof. One could call that a legacy. The ball would call it gravity finishing a sentence. And if your eyes close before the next sentence arrives, that is fine. The hill will wait at 2 minutes to 1. And so will tomorrow, and the ball, patient as ever, will rise and fall and seem for a small, perfect instant to take the earth with it. You might not expect a spell of warm weather to persuade a parliament to change its mind, but a hot July once did exactly that. The Thames lay under the sun like a tired snake, and London discovered that air can carry opinions. Windows were opened, then closed again with the embarrassed speed of someone realizing the joke is on them. Paperweights became deodorants. Clerks fanned themselves with folded bills, which was the closest the Treasury came to a scented candle. The city learned a small physics lesson. When water stops moving, everything else starts. If you are still awake in a few minutes, you can subscribe for more accounts of climate meeting plumbing, or don't. The river will keep explaining itself either way. This season arrived without hurry. Mornings were already sticky by 10, as if the day had been dipped in jam. You could watch the Thames slow down from any bridge. Barges hung in their moorings with ropes that suddenly looked philosophical. The river lapped the stone steps with the energy of tea left too long in the pot. On the strand, puddles didn't dry so much as give up. People spoke of miasma, which is the grand Victorian word for air that has decided to remember where it has been. Doctors held handkerchiefs to faces not because fabric stops a theory, but because it allows one to feel decisive. In lanes, gratings muttered. Those iron mouths where rain disappears into forgetting were talking to one another in a new, wet language, and it was not poetry. Every house had its own story, and each one ended in the same chapter. The indoor water closet, modern, proud, and frequently temperamental, offered Londoners the convenience of telling the Thames their secrets without leaving home. Pumps on riverbanks lifted citywide privacy like a bartender with bottomless ladles. Each press of a lever above sent a small biography below. If you followed one such biography from a breakfast room, you could trail it down a pipe the width of a wrist, into a lit joint polished by repetition, past a rat who looked as if he had been promoted recently, and then out through a brick culvert into the broad brown book that was the river. Multiply that by neighborhoods, and you had a community novel with an unavoidable plot. At night, the older did not sleep. Lamps added their own metallic heat to the alleys, and curtains grew damp at their hems. The smell became democratic. Dukes and drapers owned equal noses. Across the bridges, shadow chains were nailed to the water. The city's breath grew shallow, as if trying not to wake itself. Then the sun returned, and along with it, complaints turned to minutes. People who had mastered fog now discovered clarity could be worse. Carpets were sprinkled with chloride of lime. Windowsills wore it like frosting. Streets carried a pale dust, not of summer, but of chemistry. The mood of London became practical and very slightly green. Beneath the pavement, another river ran, though not a pretty one. Long before pipes made promises, Londoners hired night soilmen to lift pails from backyard pits. These men were strong, paid in the way you pay somebody to do what you absolutely cannot face. and they kept an odd schedule the neighbors pretended not to hear. When sewers grew, they were storm drains, stone throats intended for rain, which is fresh, punctual, and rarely complicated. The drains learned a new vocabulary when convenience arrived. Rain is a guest who wipes its feet. Other things are not. The old brickwork absorbed lessons it had not applied for. In the new century's confidence, cesspits were capped and forgotten, and the groundwater remembered them on behalf of everyone. When cholera visited in earlier decades, the city stared at the air and accused it eloquently. But some people drew dots on maps. A doctor named John Snow, carrying a columnist that belonged in a library, counted deaths near a water pump and quietly asked if perhaps the villain traveled by pipe. The idea was tidy. The tighter the cluster around the handle on Broad Street, the less romantic the theory became. Officials removed the pump's handle, which is the 19th century version of turning it off and on again, and the outbreak faded. Many shrugged. Others stared at the dots and felt something move, like a key in a drawer they had forgotten. The summer of stink returned them to that drawer. A civil engineer with the patient energy of a man who knows what brick can do stepped forward with a plan so large it had to begin with silence. Joseph Bazalgette did not give speeches about smells. He drew lines. His pencil laid out interceptor sewers that would skirt the old small intestines of the city and collect their enthusiasm before it reached the river in the middle of town. He proposed to carry the whole problem eastward, beyond the reach of the most sensitive members of Parliament's noses. He had a private rule, which was not secret but sounded like a confession. Build the pipe twice as big as you think you need, because London has opinions about tomorrow. People would one day call this foresight. At the time, it looked like generosity to bricklayers. While paper stained with plans sat on committee tables, heat turned the river into a witness you could not cross-examine. Members of Parliament pinned soaked rags of chloride of lime to open windows like napkins for the city's breath. One member's diary noted that the air in the chamber seemed to have taken up residence inside his head. A few suggested moving the legislature to another town until the season thought better of it. Others argued that perhaps it would be unsporting to let a river decide the calendar. Jokes were made because jokes are lighter to carry than smell. Then, in that practical way assemblies occasionally discover, the House agreed to spend money. The debates were brisk, nasal, and aware of the newspapers. Lime appeared on window ledges in careful little snowdrifts. Parliament passed an act giving London its grand sewer scheme, and though the legal language was dry, the ink had the unusual quality of smelling faintly heroic. The press reported with relief that action was underway. Contractors, brickmakers, pipe foundries, men who could persuade the earth to open politely sharpened pencils and soon after shovels. Navvies, the laborers of the age, shouldered spades with the serenity of people who understood that the ground is negotiable if approached with patience and tea. It is hard to picture a sewer politely, but the new works had style. If a cathedral is a roof held up by reverence, these were cathedrals held up by necessity. Along the river bank, embankments of stone would later straighten the Thames hem and provide promenades where couples could argue about nothing in particular. But first came tunnels, brick barrels big enough for a man to walk through tall, curving away into the earth like respectable serpents. Interceptors marched eastward, gathering side streams that once had entered the river like uninvited footnotes. Vast outfall sewers led to engines beam engines with names, as if the city asked strong friends to help lift its past. Abbey Mills would open like a dream in decorative brick and iron. A pumping station dressed for a wedding because even necessity in London likes to wear its good clothes. The project had its own weather. Work sites made fogs of dust. Men stooped under the sun, set bricks as if building a sentence that needed no commas, and found, when they looked back, that the sentence kept going. The schedule was a handshake between winter mud and summer heat. Barges brought bricks by the million, stacked in loads that made water look strong. The city watched as great trenches were cut and then disappeared, stitched up behind labor like a careful scar. Meanwhile, the river drifted between banks that had quietly begun to expect respect. Money found its nostrils too. Rates were raised, and those who wrote the checks wrote them with a mixture of reluctance and relief. There is a special sound a bill makes when it is signed by someone who knows the alternative smell. Newspapers printed cartoons where money bags were pegs on noses. Nobody minded because the bags were open. In meetings, stewards of the purse reminded everyone that cholera had a way of erasing ledgers altogether. It's hard to balance accounts when your accountants are absent for reasons connected to water. The city chose embankments over economies. Slowly, London acquired a new spine. Along the North Bank, the Victoria Embankment carried sewer, railway, and roadway together like a well-behaved braid. On the south, the Albert Embankment's granite shouldered the river back into discipline. Trees were planted above the arteries. Lamps lined up, and at night their reflections looked like the city's new heartbeat. The Thames, no longer asked to swallow everything on short notice, rediscovered the hobby of being a river. Storms could still puff its cheeks and toss boats against piers, but ordinary days lost the uneasy perfume of someone's basement. Inside Abbey Mills, engines turned with manners. The wrought iron columns curled like leaves. Steam moved pistons that lifted millions of gallons as calmly as a footman lifting a tray. Visitors wrote compliments in guest books, which is the genteel way to praise a machine for saving lives. The pumping station's polychrome brickwork made people smile, as if the city had dressed its utility in Sunday best because gratitude likes to wear something nice. Farther east, at the outfalls on the estuary, sludge settled into the tide where it could continue its career without offending a member for Westminster. The city made promises to itself that sounded like bedtime rules. Keep rain and sewer apart. Build for the child you have not yet met. Never drink your past. Plan with two of everything where one seems sufficient. Inspect what you cannot smell. Put the places where you put things where water cannot remember them. Each rule, written nowhere and kept everywhere, became a habit. It spread to other cities that had believed their rivers were nothing more than mirrors for buildings. Hydraulics learned to share. Engineers borrowed Bazalgette's pencil philosophy. Draw one size, then add another circle around it, as if gifting the future a coat. There were smaller lessons, too. Lime on a windowsill works better on a small office than on a metropolis. Handkerchiefs do little, but confidence likes them. Maps help when noses are unreliable. Dots near a pump tell a truer story than adjectives near a window. The public will tolerate vast projects if the alternative is breathing yesterday's diary. And perhaps this, water has a long memory, but it does appreciate fresh introductions. If you stand on the embankment now with an ice cream and very few worries, you can hear the new river speaking a different grammar. It mutters about tides and boats and weather rather than about households. Beneath your shoes, somewhere between the tree roots and the granite, warm tunnels run eastward with a steady humility. A train in its small burrow nearby hums hello to the sewer in its wider one, and the roadway above nods as buses move. It is a layered city, like a cake that proves the baker understands both flavor and structure. On some evenings, when the air is still and the sunset has decided to be kind, people lean on the stone and watch the water change its mind from flood to ebb. They do not think about cholera because it is polite not to summon old guests. Joggers pass with headphones. A tourist points at a gull with great seriousness. The smell is not a subject. This is what a victory looks like when it refuses to brag. The river remembers, but only as an anecdote it keeps to itself. Those who like names repeat Bazalgette's as if it were a spell, and perhaps it is. He lived long enough to see London fill his extra capacity and think him with the lightness of not dying. Engineers after him added more tunnels, bigger pipes, modern pumps that inhale and exhale with less theater. The rule of two keeps being right. The old interceptors still carry themselves with dignity. When one day a new super sewer burrows under the Thames to collect what the city learned to generate while growing, it will nod to the older brick around it, the way a young singer nods to an old standard. All this because a hot summer forced the city to taste its own punctuation. It was not a dramatic revolution. No barricades rose. Number Palace fell. Men in waistcoats held their noses and signed papers. Women pinned curtains back and sprinkled powder. Children asked why the river looked sleepy. Bargemen swore in professional paragraphs. And under the surface for years, bricks stacked themselves into arches that turned a smell into a system. If you're drifting now, that's appropriate. The story offers no chase, only a tide. Somewhere in the night, a pump starts because a float nudged a switch, and a million private decisions go east together, quiet as shoelaces. Trees along the embankment hush the wind. The river slides past the piles with the settled politeness of an old guest. It is possible to believe that cities learn, if slowly. Tonight, London closes its sash without hurrying. Ink dries at the right speed. The air is ordinary in the best way. And far below, the brick cathedrals continue their low service, which is not to be noticed. In the margins of the pencil's story lives the hardness scale, which is one of those human inventions that looks like science because it behaves so well in this form. In the USNO, 2 pencils the everyday hero. The Scantron machine simply likes it. Elsewhere, teachers speak HB as if it were a kindly relative. Artists debate 8B romanticism versus 2H discipline. There is a special pleasure in buying a tin of graded sketching pencils and arranging them from charcoal dusk to pale morning. One tin claims a charcoal black so soft that you can hear it if the room is quiet enough. Another offers an H so hard it teaches you about restraint. The scale is not absolute. Brands lean into their temperament, yet it satisfies the brain the way a tidy cutlery drawer does. Travel broadens pencils. In Japan, case cedar met a cultural affection for precise stationery and became an object of loving over design. Ferrules, the metal collar that holds the eraser received crimping worthy of jewelry. Burly carpenter pencils flattened into friendly lozenges that could be held even by hands wearing gloves and sharpened with a pocket knife into a chisel. Point fit to outline a building or underline a mistake. Meanwhile, in Bavaria and Nuremberg, companies with family names older than some countries' refined varnish recipes invented water-soluble colored cores that turn a line into a watercolor when touched with a brush, and packaged pencils like chocolates you really should use before the guests arrive. Copying practices wandered into the pencil's orbit like moths to a library lamp. Before carbon paper took up its purple career, clerks experimented with manifolding by pressure, adding backing sheets that captured faint duplicates of a letter as it was written. The right pencil hardness made 2 legible versions and preserved the writer's wrist. Later, carbon paper itself preferred the typewriter's steel fingers, but pencils still signed everything. On ships, logbooks insisted on graphite because ink washes away when the page meets weather. In hospitals, copies of charts demanded marks that smudged less than pride. Everywhere, the pencil's silent virtue was that it neither clogged nor dried, and it forgave sunlight for existing. We should pause to appreciate the small geography of a desk. Top left, the cup with pencils, some upside down with their erasers thinking. Top right, a sharpener like a quiet doorstop. Center, a blotter, unnecessary but confident. Along the back edge, an in tray of guilt and an out tray of relief. Somewhere near the phone, a pencil that is always a little duller than you hoped, which is how telephones prefer their partners. The desk is a landscape. The pencil is its resident fox appearing without fuss, leaving delicate tracks, and never quite belonging to anyone. Micro hook because we promised them regularly. In a municipal office in 1911, A clerk carefully sharpened 40 pencils every morning and placed them upright in a wooden rack. Visitors judged the city's efficiency by the height of that forest. There is, inevitably, a museum. In Keswick, near the Bardale mines, you can stand before cabinets of colored cores, prototype ferrules, and a giant novelty pencil large enough to fence a small playground. You can learn that during wartime, a company hollowed pencils to hide escape maps for airmen, then plucked the ends so cleverly that no one at the table noticed anything except that the pencil felt pleasantly light. This is the closest the pencil comes to drama, and even here the exhibition labels are calm. Elsewhere, collectors trade vintage tins with the seriousness usually reserved for stamps. They speak of lacquer shades last produced in 1963, of the exact year a family factory changed its cap color. They notice things no one meant to code. Erasers deserve a paragraph of their own because they represent the pencil's treaty with regret. Pink pearls, kneaded gray putties that lift graphite from a page like a whisper from a dream. White vinyl blocks that leave margins brighter than new paint. Each eraser has its philosophy. The kneaded sort can be pinched into a point and dabbed like patience. The vinyl sort removes not just error, but part of your day. Some erasers wear sleeves to keep fingertips clean. Some travel on pencil ends and accept their low position in life. There is a small etiquette. Erase outward to spare the line. Brush crumbs away with the back of your hand, not your breath. Do not erase a signature unless you plan to move to another town. Eventually, a pencil becomes a memory plus some shavings. You may find one in a coat from 3 winters ago with the point still sharp, as if it had been working in the lining. You may find another in a field, weathered to a pale, soft stick, whose graphite peeks through like a seam of evening. Builders lose them in walls, where they live until the house comes down and someone calls it an artifact. Teachers keep them in coffee cans and watch them migrate through classrooms like small wooden fish. Each has a few centimeters of story, a shopping list, an address copied from a friend's phone, a crossword rescued in the quiet of a waiting room. The tool is modest. The itinerary is not. If we switch the light off a little, we can hear pencils in their cups make the faintest chime. Wood against wood, the sound of a drawer closing, the click of a mechanical's lead advance. This is office music at its most restful. The moment before a page receives a word is a kind of weather. The point hovers. Graphite leaves its tiny flakes, future dust motes rehearsing for the sunbeam. A line begins. It is not dramatic. It is the oldest trick, carbon arranging itself so that humans can see what they were thinking. And when you stop, the pencil waits, and the waiting is also writing. Some subjects insist on endings. Pencils politely decline. They fade into stubs, into extenders, into the easy choreography of another box opening. They gather in a jar near the door so you can write a note that says back soon, and then be, or they travel in a cook. This pocket to annotate a recipe so gently that the next generation can still taste it. The pencil asks for no maintenance schedule, no outlet, no software update. If a piece snaps, you sharpen again. If an idea detours, you erase or don't. Smudges are a fine biography. By now, you might notice your breathing has matched the pace of shaving cedar, steady and a little fragrant in the imagination. The world reduces to useful surfaces, wood, paper, the page of an old notebook that took years to fill because pencils, unlike stories about them, do not hurry. Somewhere a night watchman signs a form with a dull HB, the kind of mark that will be visible in the morning even if the light is unambitious. Somewhere else, a student underlines one sentence in a library book with the faintest pressure and then spends 10 minutes trying to erase it perfectly. A domestic comedy with no audience. The pencil approves. It always did. You can leave the jar where it is. Tomorrow one will be shorter and nothing terrible will have happened. Quite the opposite. There is comfort in that mathematics. The pencil promises that progress is measurable in millimeters and that millimeters are enough. So we let the cup stand guard, we let the cedar scent move the air by a fraction, we let graphite train the hand to forgive itself line by line. The room cools, the page waits. The tiny hexagon does its quiet geometry against your fingers. If you're still awake, you could subscribe, or simply set the pencil down where its shadow is longest and listen to the soft, dull tick it makes. Either way, the little stick will be here when you return, willing to write your next ordinary miracle in a voice no louder than sleep. You might not expect a tiny stick of cedar and graphite to have a biography, but pencils keep longer diaries than most people. They live in drawers and cups and jacket pockets, and when they finally speak, it is in a gray whisper that looks like thought behaving itself. If you're still awake by the time we reach indelible violet copy pencils, feel free to subscribe for more extremely quiet adventures and office supplies, but truly, don't strain. The pencil is patient, and so am I. It begins in the ground, as tidy stories often do when they want to avoid excitement. North of England, Baradale, a hillside that produced a pure, solid kind of graphite so clean that people first mistook it for some tractable, polite cousin of coal. Shepherds cut chunks and marked their sheep. Artists learned that the strange ore slid across paper the way a shadow slides over sound. Then the ore began to thin because minds and patience share a predictable curve, and Europe discovered that good pencils would require chemistry rather than muck. Enter Nicolas Jacques Conti in the 1790s, stirring powdered graphite with clay and slow fire, inventing a recipe you can measure with a spoon. The mixture behaved, fire tempered it. No drama, just a kills warm paragraph, and afterwards a rod of potential so well behaved that entire bureaucracies would one day lean on it. What is the pencil's coat? American red cedar, smooth-grained and accommodating, learned to fold itself around the graphite and clay heart with a kind of barber's dexterity. Mills sliced the wood into incense-thin slats, cut grooves like smiles, set rods in the grooves, and then paired the slots together as if seating strangers at a polite dinner. The glue made no speeches. A plane smoothed the hexagon. The hexagon had its reasons. It didn't roll, it stacked nicely, and it suggested virtue by geometry. Varnish dressed the result in the modest gloss that still looks like a Monday morning. One factory anecdote says the smell of fresh-shaved cedar could make even an accountant momentarily lyrical. Another says that a day's worth of shavings looks like a small red river that forgot what it was supposed to be doing. The lead is not lead. You know this, but the air is comfortable, like calling every soft drink soda. Graphite writes by sliding layers of carbon atoms over each other, like plates in a cabinet that have agreed not to clatter. The clay in the mix persuades those layers how quickly to slide. More clay, harder line. Less clay, softer line, deeper shadow. Manufacturers, being sociable people who love a scale, introduce letters and numbers to tame this spectrum. Thus the HB parade, H for hard, B for black, numbers marching outward toward extremes that few handwriting teachers actually recommend. A 2B makes a polite darkness. A6H will take a crisp, nervous bite out of a page and then insist you meant it. An early pencil did not erase itself easily. People rubbed marks with breadcrumbs, an approach that works better on a desk than on a sandwich. In the 1770s, someone noticed that the strange sap called caoutchouc rubber had a tidy appetite for graphite. Later, vulcanization gave rubbers a backbone, and the famous pink plug found its throne at the end of American school pencils. European pencils often refused this hat, preferring a naked end or a tiny metal cap that looked like a thimble for a fairy. Meanwhile, the office ecosystem adjusted. Eraser crumbs collected like pale snow along the margins of ambition. Desk brushes tidied them away with ecclesiastical gravity. Somewhere a clerk wrote "received" and tapped the page with the bristles as if blessing it. There were eccentric cousins. The copy pencil, for instance, wore a purple secret, an aniline dye tucked among the graphite so that a wet press could coax a duplicate onto a thin second sheet. It was the quiet ancestor of carbon copy and photocopier, smelling faintly of violets and bureaucracy. People were warned not to lick the tip because the dye could mark more than paper. Nonetheless, exams across continents feature a generation of students with faintly purple fingers and answers the supervisor would rather not discuss. Another cousin, the indelible pencil, wrote a line that water could not persuade to forget, useful for labeling packages and less useful for apologies. Micro hook. In at least one office, a man was dismissed for writing 2 entire weeks of minutes in copy pencil on the original copy, thus preserving everything twice and pleasing no one. Life at the desk taught the pencil its manners. Sharpening was a ritual. The sound of a small blade paring cedar is the nearest thing to audible concentration. Some schools forbade knives and issued little brass sharpeners shaped like friendly beetles. Others provided wall-mounted crank machines that ate a pencil with cheerful precision and a hint of cruelty. People argued about points. A draftsman's needlepoint, hard and fine, could write a law that would never wobble. An artist's soft cone laid down shadows like persuasive weather. The average office preferred something in between, a point sturdy enough for a signature, forgiving enough to make your handwriting look as if you were on okay terms with yourself. Stubbs invited philosophy. The pencil gets shorter, not because something is wrong, but because it is doing what it promised. Enter the pencil extender, a dignified little tube that gave tired survivors new reach. Clerks kept them in pen trays like spectacles for small wooden elders. The frugal saved shavings for kindling. The sentimental saved stubs and drawers that became small museums of finished tasks. Somewhere on every continent there is a cup holding a pencil worn down to an inch that says, "The rest of me is in your ledger." Some companies offered a buyback rate for pencil stubs by weight, a program so lacking in glamour that it becomes charming. The economy of office life is essentially an anthology of these gestures. Pencils also revealed social rules. On shared desks, the unspoken compact was that you returned a borrowed pencil slightly sharper than you found it. To chew or not to chew was a matter of family culture. Some people left a tidy crescent of tooth marks near the end, the wooden equivalent of a sigh. Others believed that a pencil should never meet a molar. Many tucked one behind an ear, a gesture that made even a relaxed carpenter look as if he knew his week by name. In exam halls, invigilators laid extra pencils on the front desk the way hosts put out spare umbrellas. Sooner or later someone would ask whether mechanical pencils were allowed, and a small debate would bloom that never reached a conclusion, because all good pencil debates are permanent drafts. Mechanical pencils arrived with the clack of springs discovering modest fame. They promised a line that did not taper with use, a lead that extended with a click, a barrel that stayed the same height from Monday to Friday. Engineers liked the management of diameter, 0.3 for hairlines, 0.5 for ordinary tasks, 0.7 for notes that might need to survive a backpack. Artists learned to shade with a splash of rotation. The mechanism made a faint sound like a polite grasshopper. Yet even as mechanicals clicked their way through the 20th century, the cedar stick stayed on, unscheduled, uncomplicated, and entirely recyclable, the office equivalent of bread. Factories turned out oceans of them. At one American plant, inspectors rolled finished pencils across a small glass plate to listen for a wobble. A wobble hinted that the core was off-center and that writing would feel like conversation with a limping companion. Another plant color-dipped ends by hand, hundreds an hour, operators pausing to scratch a real itch while their work pretended to scratch imaginary ones. Boxes were slid into sleeves that had opinions about fonts. Export logs recorded places far away learning the smell of cedar, schoolrooms where the first thing a child learned to write was their own name, and the second was a reason for a new pencil. You might not expect a summer to have a smell with footnotes, but London in 1858 wrote a whole bibliography in the air. The heat pressed its thumb on the river and left it there, and the Thames, usually busy rehearsing its ripples, settled into the role of a patient in a thick blanket. Curtains were unhelpful. They hung like sleepy tongues. The tide came in, then decided thinking about it was enough for one afternoon, and went nowhere in particular. Clerks learned how quickly ink dries when a room behaves like a kettle. A messenger fanned himself with a folded bill and discovered that economy can create a breeze, though not a useful one. If you find yourself still awake by the time we reach the lime-soaked windowsills of Parliament, feel free to subscribe, or simply breathe shallowly as Victorians did. I'll never know, and the river isn't saying anything clearly. The path to the water always seems short in a city. It hides behind steps, behind gratings that burble like discreet cousins, behind gulls that take notes in a handwriting made of footprints. Each grating had a story, and in that summer, all the stories agreed on one endpoint. Rain, when it bothered to visit, tamped dust into a paste and ushered the city's leftovers toward the curb. House drains, proud of their recent convenience, marched small breakfasts and vigorous opinions through trapdoors that clicked like satisfied jaws. Everything ended at the Thames, because tradition likes a river and waste is traditional. Night brought no rescue. The air stalled as though waiting for a conductor. Let the smell take the solo. Lamps hummed with moths. Windows learned to be closed even when the house wanted to exhale. And across the bridges, the barges rested like punctuation nailed to a sentence. Under the houses, another house. London had a second architecture where the rooms were narrow and the furniture moved. Cesspit, so many, so loyal, had long made arrangements with night soil men. Arrangements conducted like a quiet waltz at unfashionable hours. But the city had been growing faster than a ledger could add, and convenience outpaced this choreography. Engineers had been busy elsewhere, with gas and rails and structures that declared ambition by simply refusing to wobble in the wind. Sewers lagged behind, old brick corridors counting the steps of horse storms and never meeting each other politely. In 1858, the sun leaned in, and the river failed to lean out, and the whole vocabulary of drains learned a new grammar. Present perfect continuous. The household mud becomes a gutter. The gutter becomes a channel. The channel becomes a sermon. The theory that ruled the nose ruled the mind. Miasma illness as bad air with excellent memory-folded scented handkerchiefs over anxious faces and declared the matter settled. Physicians were undecided in all the right ways. Maps that would one day draw cholera like constellations had not been pinned where they could argue with anyone. Downstream and upstream behaved like cousins at a reunion who have promised to be civil. People stood on bridges and practiced the art of breathing through their sleeves. Not all sleeves cooperated. A barrister wrote that the smell had a familiarity one wishes were less enthusiastic. Newspapers compared the Thames to soup, to gravy, to a solution in which Parliament itself was just another ingredient, over-seasoned and opinionated. This is the kind of simile a heatwave likes, culinary and resigned. Beneath the pavement, other rivers. When it rained, brick sellers learned to speak in brown. Letters in careful hands described water rising with a courtesy that felt personal. Night carts, the old safeguard retired early those nights. Their horses selecting patients from the stable's menu, and their drivers squinting at street lamps that seemed to have shrunk. The city's rate books had a smell of their own, but even they lost the argument to the air outside. If you pressed an ear to the grating, you heard London practicing the world's most discouraged drum roll. It is, in retrospect, the sound of an idea rummaging for its boots. Ideas need sketches. A quiet engineer sketched large. Joseph Bazalgette, who wore modesty like a well-fitted waistcoat, laid a ruler across maps and discovered that London's underworld was not dramatic enough to be useful. His proposal was not a revolution, which is often noisy, but multiplication, which is stealthy. Build big. Build two when one will do. Intercept before the river reads its mail. Escort the city's messages eastward with composure. The rule of two. They called it later the way a careful cook doubles a recipe and ends up feeding a neighborhood. Interceptor sewers, great brick corridors, would run alongside the Thames like patient ushers, gathering what the little drains had gossiped and whispering it out to sea at an appropriate distance. Embankments would follow, containing water with lines so straight they looked like a decision from far away. Above ground, the nation learned that debate can be olfactory. The House of Commons opened its sash windows and discovered that law has a nose. Lime strong, chalky, and mindful of smells appeared on windowsills and bowls, a domestic gesture scaled up into statcraft. Members dabbed handkerchiefs with perfume and then spoke briskly through them, which lent every argument an odd nasal urgency. Heavily starched sentences marched back and forth, while outside the Thames exhaled at a tempo that made stenography seem heroic. Here's a micro-episode. One member, having carefully moistened his handkerchief with lavender, sneezed during the word sanitary, and the entire gallery pretended not to notice in the interest of national dignity. Money, which often takes its time arriving but walks quickly once it is late, found the nostrils too. Rates were raised in a tone of apology. Letters scolded, then coughed, then agreed to be practical. An act of parliament slipped through like a window opened after a storm. Contracts unfurled their ribbons. Brickmakers sang in that deep, dusty register that makes a kill sound like a choir in navvies, shouldered the earth as if it were a quiet favor for an old friend. Along the riverbank, the first arch closed, and a gull, offended by the change in acoustics, launched into air it didn't like and forgave immediately. The city watched these beginnings with the indulgent uncertainty you reserve for a cousin's ambitious hobby that looks, at the moment, like several thousand bricks and a rumor of progress. Work requires repetition that knows how to hum. The brick sewers rose like cathedrals built sideways, their curves perfect if you lay on your back and measured with a squint. Each course of bricks repeated a prayer, that gravity would continue to be reliable and that Victorian mortar would age like a seasoning cast iron pan. The Zaljet's drawings grew confident, then habitual. On scaffolds, men ate lunches that had learned to attract dust by instinct. Clerks recorded load after load of ballast, the city's appetite growing in tidy columns. Tools developed nicknames. So did certain corners. There is a photograph of navvies lounging in a tunnel with clothes indistinguishable from the brick, faces bright as the idea they served. They look like men who know a city is a kind of organism and that this is the new spine. Embankments straightened the Thames the way a librarian straightens a shelf. Mud was pressed into a geometry that allowed promenades to happen and sewage to pass without conversation. Outfalls farther east took the city's indiscretions and introduced them to the tide with a politeness learned from the drawing board. Abbey Mill's pumping station, when finished, was a cathedral of brick and iron, a place where machinery dressed up. Steam engines lifted the weight of London's dailiness with a rhythm that calmed even those who considered themselves uncalmable. Visitors noted panels of tiled color and thought, this is what respect looks like when you give it a job. Disease, which dislikes being predictable, began to retreat in spots. Cholera's map, once a comet's tail of sorrow sliding across neighborhoods, faded to a scattering of distant dots. Miasma, the theory with the excellent vocabulary, began to lose its debate with evidence. But the city did not shout. It nodded, the way one nods at an old teacher who turns out to have been charmingly wrong. Water closets, newly confident, flushed in better directions. Drains learned not to gossip to wells. A whole generation discovered that the smell of a river is not destiny. Meanwhile, printers kept an inventory of adjectives in case the air misbehaved again. They found fewer uses for effluvia. They kept whiff because a city always needs whiff. Parliament eventually closed some windows and opened others. Speeches quieted, votes were tallied, and the act, exhausted but triumphant, sat down where acts sit. Finance behaved like sleepwalking that knows where the stairs are. Municipal ledgers stopped fanning themselves and practiced the long, slow breathing of amortization. If you liked microhooks, and we promise one every minute or so, consider a clerk who dated a payment authorization after storm instead of with an actual day. The entry remains in the archive, a tiny weather report with a number attached. When the first flushes raced along the interceptors like well-behaved foxes, the city did not cheer out loud. It listened. The deep brick corridors spoke in a lower key than the summer had, and their voice carried a peculiar reassurance. Sound that means movement, movement that means distance, distance that means forgiveness. Children stood with their parents on the new embankments and watched engineers lean on railings as if they had invented iron, which to them, in those moments, felt more or less true. The river looked slimmer in its new jacket. Steam launches puttered by with a posture that suggested good grooming. Boatmen complained that the current had acquired opinions. They adapted and then forgot they had adapted. What remains after smell is lesson. Infrastructure is the public face of hygiene with its hat off. You build for two when one would do, because the city you cannot yet see has already put its foot in the doorway. You carry storm and sewer apart, like siblings to separate tables, and you do not let them switch name tags. You lay pipes at gradients so gentle that patients can flow downhill. You appoint inspectors who measure bricks with string and write in notebooks that discover, on quiet afternoons, that they smell faintly of lime. You create a system that a bored child can understand with a pencil and a slope, and then you create it again for safety. At night, with windows open to the kinder end of a breeze, people slept differently. Not because the world became perfect, it never files that report, but because a particular background note had been tuned. There were still carts and hoofbeats and the murmurs of houses thinking. There were certainly other smells, horses, fires, ambition, but the city's main exhalation now went elsewhere, escorted by engines and brick and the orderly gravity of mathematics. Tonight, someone closed a sash without a wince of ceremony, and returned to the table to add up a column as long as patience. The moon watched the river turn without gossiping to the streets. Those embankments still hold, their lines like an aging but stubborn ruler. Trains dip and surface along them. Benches host sandwiches and decisions. Joggers discover that history makes a good loop. Underfoot, the interceptors continue to whisper east, as if telling the sea a story it already knows. Abbey Mills stands like a handsome apology for a problem solved later than it should have been. Farther downstream, modern plants hum, which is the technological term for behaving oneself. On hot days, because London still has them, the air pauses, thinks of 1858, and decides to mind its manners. Micro-hop before we drift. A tourist once asked a guide if the Great Stink was an annual festival. The guide said, "No, but the solution is permanent," and pointed down. If you're counting breaths, take the next one slowly. We have reached the gentle end of our tide. The city remembered to think underground before it decorated above. The smell wrote its single, forceful petition, and engineers replied with brick sentences that have not ended yet. Somewhere a maintenance crew in orange walks a tunnel that curves like the inside of a quiet bell. They talk about football and tea and the gradient, which is steady. The river moves past, convinced of its direction. The night lays a hand on London's back, finds the new spine, and approves without comment. and we let the room cool. We let the page gather a little dust. We let that old summer drift into a museum case you don't have to visit. The windows can stay just where they are. The air, having learned a lesson, behaves. And the city is cities. Duin may have had a bath, goes to sleep cleaner than it woke. You might not expect a bolt to have an accent, but for a long time, every village spoke screw a little differently. In the centuries before standards, a screw was a local dialect in metal, whispered by a file and a lathe and a craftsman who liked his angles neat or not. A carpenter might carry a box of screws with personalities, one with a fat, lazy spiral that refused to hurry. Another cut so sharply it seemed to climb the wood out of politeness. A wheelwright's bolt fit a wheelwright's nut and almost nothing else, which is a pleasant way to guarantee repeat business but hard on travelers. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe. If you've already dozed off on the phrase fat, lazy spiral, that's also an appropriate response to early industrial threading. Screw thread is a simple idea pretending to be complicated. It is a ramp wrapped into a circle, an infinite staircase that goes nowhere in particular and is proud of it. If you tilted that staircase until the steps became almost flat, you'd call the distance between them the pitch. If you stood the staircase upright and measured the angle of its side, you'd call that a thread form. Craftsmen did this in their heads while squinting. The result was impressive in the way a nice penmanship is impressive, elegant, consistent within one notebook, and occasionally illegible to strangers. A bolt from Birmingham might ignore a nut from Bristol. A Parisian screw would sniff at a Lyonnais thread. You could file one to fit the other with patience and tea, and people did. Which is how you turn an afternoon into a small memorial to stubbornness. The Industrial Revolution, which loved the word repeat almost as much as it loved the word steam, grew tired of bespoke argument between pieces of metal. Factories wanted to make many of the same thing, including many of the same fastener, because life is easier when the box you reach for does not surprise you. Machines wanted their parts to be replaceable by humans who had not met the original machinist, and did not share his views on the ideal angle of a spiral. Railways wanted bolts that could be swapped in rain by people who would prefer not to guess widths by candlelight. And so the notion of standard moved quietly from paper to shop floor. Somewhere a clerk drew lines. Somewhere a foreman said, yes, exactly those lines. Somewhere a worker, never asked before, can now order a thread by number and have it arrive like a promise in a crate. Britain found its standardizer in Joseph Whitworth, a man whose beard looked like it could measure itself. In the 1840s, he proposed that a thread should be cut at a 55-degree angle with rounded crusts and roots, polite curves instead of pointed teeth. He surveyed workshops across the country the way a botanist surveys hedgerows, collecting dimensions people already liked, then averaged them into a system with pitches matched to diameters. It was less a decree than a carefully rendered shrug. Since you are all doing roughly this, let us all do exactly this. The Whitworth thread spread because it felt familiar. It had the quiet authority of a school timetable and the kindness of a well-drawn ruler. A machinist could now ask for a 1/2 inch Whitworth bolt and mean something beyond, please send what we used last time. The beauty of standardization is that it makes very boring things reliably boring. Thread gauges, little metal combs that look like pocket fish flowered in toolboxes. A gauge told you a pitch without argument. Nuts traveled in sacks like sensible seeds. The rounded valleys of Whitworth's profile reduced stress and kindly delayed the day a part cracked, which is what kindness looks like in steel. Micro hook for the minute. British fire hydrants adopted varying thread schemes anyway, because tradition enjoys an exception. Some towns still hold adapters at the ready. Small metal translators so water can attend the emergency in the correct syntax. Across the Atlantic, the United States listened, nodded, and cleared its throat. William Sellers, another engineer with a fondness for order, offered a slightly different scheme in 1864. His threads used a 60-degree angle and flat. Crests and roots easier to machine on American equipment, which liked its cuts straightforward. Sellers' threads marched into factories with the clip of a new drill bit. The American standard became useful to Americans, which is a concise description of most standards. The two systems were close enough to be friendly, but not close enough to share wardrobes. A Whitworth nut would take a Sellers bolt only with the enthusiasm of a shoe accepting the wrong sock. Then came the metric world, which had an argument with inches and won by existing peacefully. The metric thread also used a 60-degree form but expressed itself in millimeters, and there is something soothing about millimeters at night. They glide quietly in even numbers. A 6 1mm bolt means 6 millimeters across, 1 millimeter of pitch. You can say it half asleep and still be correct. Meanwhile, pipes develop their own cosmology. Because fluids like to seal with a squeeze, pipe threads tapered. The American NPT and the British BC share this tapering habit, but do not agree on the precise attitude. They seal with tape, wound in the direction that tightens as you turn, a habit you can practice on a sleepy afternoon until muscle memory does the remembering for you. An odd courtesy arises in dangerous gases, left-hand threads. To prevent mix-ups, fittings for acetylene or flammable gas reverse the normal direction. Righty-tighty, lefty-loosey becomes something like righty-loosey, lefty-dash, or dash-you-dash-sure. The knurling on the nut will often have little grooves cut as warning stripes. A bicycle's left pedal does this too, not for fire, but for physics. It tightens against use, so it cannot unspool itself while you go somewhere slowly heroic. Micro hook again. Camera tripods worldwide use 1/4 20 threads. A small imperial island in a metric sea, because early cameras drilled that habit deeply. And habits in photography last longer than we think. If you own a tripod and a microscope adapter, they might shake hands like old acquaintances, despite having nothing else in common. Standardization did not arrive as thunder. It arrived like shelving. Catalogs expanded until you could calm yourself by reading them. One could buy a bolt by length, diameter, grade, and coating, then forget the entire transaction except for the pleasant feeling of a box snug with small cylinders. The most dramatic sentences were zinc-plated and galvanized. The new quiet allowed complicated machines to act modest. A printing press could whisper to itself because its fasteners were not arguing. A bridge could lean on predictable sets of hexagons. When a bolt failed, and they do, the way shoes wear through, its replacement knew how to fit simply by knowing what it was called. Thread pitch is not glamorous, but it is quietly philosophical. A coarse pitch moves far with every turn. It is a sprinter. A fine pitch advances with patience. It is a watchmaker. Coarse threads forgive dirt and hurry. Fine threads hold tension and trust calibrated torque. There is a reason a vice screw is bold and a micrometer screw is shy. Engineers treat these as moods and choose accordingly. You can see the difference with your fingertips, a tiny braille of intent. Thread form whispers longevity, pitch whispers temperament, diameter whispers capacity, material whispers weather. In a way, a bolt is just a poem in steel that ends with a nut. Of course, many standards can live on one planet. The ISO consolidated metric threads in methodical reports that read like lullabies in outline form. The Unified Thread Standard tried to reconcile American practice with British and Canadian manufacture. It adopted 60-degree forms with UNC for coarse and UNF for fine. Tidy abbreviations that sound like gentle interjections. The Whitworth family moved into specialized corners. The BSP thread stayed for pipes, another cousin, BSW, lingered in old machinery and the drawers of people who swear this coffee grinder will work again someday. Museums collect sample plates with gleaming spirals and numbers etched like addresses. A student runs a finger across the rows and learns, without any arithmetic, what persistence feels like. There's a small comedy in the way nuts and bolts meet. The first threads touch, then the next, and then the whole helix takes the hint. If the threads are cousins, they ask for a file. If they are strangers, they ask for patience. If they match, they breathe. Cross-threading happens when enthusiasm outruns geometry. Everyone has done it once. The part resists, you insist. And suddenly, a perfectly good afternoon is wearing a tiny crown of mild regret. The remedy is to back off, align, and begin again, which is also a decent recipe for several human situations. Fire hydrants, already mentioned as traditionalists, deserve a drowsy footnote. In the 19th century, different cities chose different threads for their hose couplings, a local pride that became an inconvenience when neighboring towns tried to help each other put out literal fires. Adapters proliferated like bilingual dictionaries. To this day, some departments carry metalinguist couplings that translate a hose's accent at the curb. Sleeper microhook, a hydrant thread once delayed and out of town. Brigade long enough for the newspapers to learn a new synonym for irked. The standardized national hose thread reduced these moments, though not all of them. Some standards are like cats. They come when they like. The bolt's head tells stories too. Hexagons dominate because a wrench can grip at 6 angles and still find room for its elbow. Squares remain in older places where tools were sleeves and men were habits. Socket heads retreat into their holes like shy neighbors. Slotted heads prefer drama and strip themselves for the excitement. Phillips heads were designed to slip a little so an assembly line worker wouldn't shear a screw off by accident, the screw equivalent of a fainting couch. Torx heads arrived with starry confidence and the gift of not camming out. This is bedtime trivia that does not need to keep you awake, but it will if you let it. Asterous metals make their own weather. Steel bolts receive grades of strength like exam scores. 8.8, 10.9, 12.9 in metric, 5 and 8 in imperial, stamped on their heads like little declarations. Stainless steel resists rust but can seize galling, a polite word for two smooth surfaces deciding to marry without permission. A dab of anti-seize acts as counselor. Brass behaves with grace near water and musicians. Aluminum needs careful torque. Titanium is a show-off on bicycles where grams matter more than gravity would prefer. Coatings widen the wardrobe. Black oxide for a serious look. Zinc for cheerful resilience. Hot dip galvanizing for long walks on salty beaches. Each choice comes with a chart, and each chart is a lullaby in columns. Left to themselves, standards breed small, successful conveniences. Jar lids in North America, for example, use standard neck finishes, 70 to 450, 63 to 400, numbers that let glass talk to metal without ever meeting first. Champagne bottles hide a 6mm thread under the wire cage that holds the cork's ambition in check. It backs off exactly 6 half turns, a ritual that feels ceremonial because it is. Garden hoses in the United States use 3/4 to 11.5 NH thread. In Europe, they do not, which contributes to vacations spent admiring fittings. Light bulbs once had regional threads to Edison's E26 in North America. E27 elsewhere a difference. So small it has caused quiet moments of head tilt in hardware. Aisles from Toronto to Toulouse. What slowly emerged from all, this is not a single world screw, but a dependable handful of them, each radiating from its industry like a clock face with fewer numbers. Aircraft fasteners have their own language because altitude prefers certainty. Oil fields stamp out huge threads shaped for pipes that must neither argue nor weep. Medical implants follow a different geometry altogether, designed to live politely with bone. The principle is the same ramp in a circle, but the manners change with the company. It is touching, really, how flexible a spiral can be when asked nicely. In the workshop, torque wrenches click like small metronomes. That click is an agreement between metals to stop acting heroic and start acting long term. Manuals prescribe tightness the way recipes prescribe salt. A bolt stretches slightly under correct torque. It is a taut violin string holding parts in duet. Too loose and the music chatters. Too tight and the string fails. The wrench's gentle tick lets you leave the joint with confidence and move on to the next without a lecture. Somewhere a mechanic finishes a pattern crisscross on the cylinder head, star on a wheel, and wipes a hand on a rag that knows all the songs. Between maintenance and neglect lives thread locker, a syrupy spell that convinces a bolt to stay where it is. Blue thread locker is the reasonable friend who reminds you not to overdo things. Red is the relative who takes your keys until morning. On bicycles, a tiny drop on the bottle cage screws prevents the small rattle that convinces you the countryside has opinions. On airplanes, safety wire loops through drilled bolt heads in tidy figure eights. Each twist a signature that says, "I was here and I intend to stay." These details will not keep you awake unless you decide to count them like sheep. It is hard to dramatize the moment the world stopped arguing about thread angles, because it happened in catalogs and meetings, then on shop floors where drama is frowned upon, but the result is everywhere. A kitchen chair that stops wobbling after a quarter turn, a doorknob that tightens in the time it takes tea to pour, a lamp restored because the old brass nut knew exactly who it was across 80 years. Standardization made repair feel like a neighborly visit instead of a diplomatic mission. It allowed thrift to be practical rather than heroic. In a very soft way, it made permanence portable. And so the bolt survived modernization by becoming more itself. It still climbs its ramp. It still asks for a partner who understands its steps. It still carries bridges, chairs, railways, microscopes, eyeglasses, and the odd garden gate that sighs when you close it. You can hold one between finger and thumb and feel the entire quiet politics of the 19th century spiraling under your nail. If you listen, which is optional at this hour, you can hear Whitworth's 55 Degrees whispering to Sellers' 60, and both of them nodding to the metric crowd that arrived with clean notebooks. Somewhere, a pipe fitter wraps tape clockwise without thinking. Somewhere else, a cyclist fingers the left pedal in reverse. A small ritual of trust that we end, not with a conclusion, but with a drawer. You open it, and inside are labeled compartments. M61. 1/4 to 20, 5, 16 to 18. M8 times 1.25. The labels are neat, but the bolts mix themselves anyway, because drawers are ecosystems. You pick one up, check its head, and test it against a nut with the unhurried patience of late evening. The threads engage and wander inward together, a matched pair walking down a stair you cannot see. No fanfare, no drama, just the familiar hush of metal deciding to agree. And if your eyes narrow a little at the tiny click of success, that is only the workshop's way of saying good night. You might not expect the slow fall of a wooden sphere to hold the attention of a harbor, but for a long, drowsy century, a great many people scheduled their day around exactly that. A time ball is honest about its ambitions. It climbs a mast in the morning, waits in public, and then near noon drops in a plain, well-mannered way. No trumpets, no speeches, just gravity doing office work. Ship chronometers watched, pocket watches listened, and the city learned to keep a collective blink for the moment it fell. If you're still awake, you can stay for the bit where we discuss the difference between a ball that descends and a ball that plummets. If you drift off during the phrase, rate correction by eye, that is both understandable and, frankly, historically appropriate. The problem was longitude, which is a polite term for where are we sideways. Sailors knew latitude from the height of the sun or the Southern Cross. But to know longitude, You needed time, your time versus the prime meridian's time, because the Earth spins through 15 degrees of longitude per hour, as neatly as a clock tidally chewing its way through lunch. If your ship's chronometer read noon while Greenwich said it was 1, you were 15 degrees west of where Greenwich insisted the polite world map placed you. A chronometer, however, is a living thing in a brass case. It gains on humid days, loses in the cold, sulks with the motions of the sea, and only rarely admits any of this in advance. So ports began offering a daily reassurance. Stand on deck. Look up. When the ball drops, write down the chronometer's reading. Calculate how fast it is wandering from the truth. Apply that small, mathematical apology to every observation you make until land takes pity on you again. A time ball requires a modest architecture of anticipation. At dawn, a keeper climbs to the platform wool coat, small toolbox, the kind of hat that promises nobody will shout. He checks the cordage and the guide rails. He winds the clockwork or tests the electromagnet. He pulls the cover off the painted wooden sphere, which is always larger in person than you expect, as if the harbor preferred its punctuation oversized. At a prescribed minute before noon, the ball rises to a preparatory position halfway up the mast, a courteous signal to ready your eyes and your arithmetic. A few minutes later, it climbs to the top, and silence acquires a gentle pressure, like a room waiting for someone to finish a sentence. At exactly the appointed second, the mechanism withdraws a peg or cuts current to a magnet. The ball begins to fall, which it does not by leaping, but by surrendering. And the moment it kisses the bottom collar is the moment that matters. From across the harbor, from the hill with the observatory, from deck after deck where men with pencils lean on the rail, time becomes visible, and then it is gone again, leaving behind small figures and logbooks that will stand between a captain and a reef. The first of these contraptions arrived in Portsmouth in 1829, a practical experiment with an elegant aftertaste. Greenwich followed in 1833 at Flamsteed House, with a ball that came to define correctness the way a dictionary defines spelling, quietly and by repetition. New York placed one at the Western Union Building, Boston at its Custom House, Sydney on Observatory Hill, where it still performs as if retirement were an unseemly modern fad. Littleton in New Zealand used gunpowder to signal a drop when the telegraph failed, which is a very 19th century compromise between precision and noise. Halifax's ball learned to winter at ground level. Edinburgh's kept company with a cannon. San Francisco tried one on Telegraph Hill and discovered soft. Micro hook here, that fog can make exactness feel like listening to a whispered secret through a pillow. Everything about a time ball invites small obsessions. Balls were red or black, and often had slats to reduce wind resistance, as if resigning themselves to meteorology. Their diameters were chosen for visibility against sky that never quite matched the brochure. Their masts were taller than the surrounding roofs, but shorter than ambition. Their drop mechanisms developed identities, at first purely mechanical with ropes and humans whose attention was a critical component. Later electrical, the signal, sent along wire from an observatory clock that was itself corrected by watching stars cross a wire in a telescope, which is as relaxing to imagine as it is exhausting to perform. The keepers learned local customs, such as dropping on Greenwich Mean Time, even if a town had its own private noon, or another micro-hook delaying by a minute in Liverpool, so ships wouldn't confuse the ball with a neighboring church bell's enthusiastic habit of ringing early. Not every day cooperated. Wind could wedge the ball against its track and make noon a negotiation. Rain swelled wood. Salt persuaded iron to practice anthropology by becoming an artifact. The telegraph sometimes didn't. On those days, the keeper would drop by eye at the correct second according to his best personal clock, which is a charming way to write, "We did what we could." Captains learned to note weather with their time checks. Ball fell slow in gale, obscured by mist. No drop, gun fired. There was, in this habitual recording of noon, a domestic rhythm to life at sea. You knew what your ship's heart sounded like. You knew how it wandered and how to call it back. You verified the instrument that would define your charts, and then you went about the business of long, patient distances. Meanwhile, cities were learning to share their hours. Before telegraph wires stitched the country, each town kept its own solar time, which is adorable if you like watches with conditions. Noon in Bristol arrived a few minutes after noon in London. Railway passengers felt the difference in the form of missed connections and apologetic station masters. The railways pushed for railway time, a standardized scheme with GMT as its quiet boss, which is how timetables stopped reading like poetry and began to sound like prose. Time balls fit neatly into this culture of agreement. Everyone could see the decision happen. "We will all be wrong together," said the red sphere, and therefore right. Noon guns joined the habit. In Cape Town, the gun still speaks promptly. In Halifax, the noon gun came to be loved for its predictable startle. In Hong Kong, it became corporate, a tiny ritual of capitalist punctuality. The Trinity House ball at Deal worked with a gun that barked for those who couldn't see, the artillery version of subtitles. If you have ever counted French fries so everyone at the table gets the same number, you know the spirit of these arrangements. They were the social life of accuracy, held outdoors where gulls could also be on time. The telegraph produced a special kind of calm anxiety. Observatories could now transmit time across long wires with less argument from clouds. The Greenwich signal traveled along the rail lines. Clocks snapped or nudged themselves into agreement as if reminded by a discreet cough. You could buy a mantel clock that corrected nightly, a device that is basically an apology machine with hands. Jewelers who had previously wrapped their authority around a chronometer by reputation began to place small brass plates in their windows, announcing electric time received here, which is the horological equivalent of a cafe calling itself fair trade. The balls themselves often became electrically triggered because wires do not forget to pull. There were personality clashes. New York's ball at 195 Broadway lowered its status from astronomical to commercial electricity and then to memory. The one at Washington, D.C. failed theatrically during a demonstration for Congress, which is exactly the sort of thing an earnest piece of public service would do when politics asks it to dance. In Sydney, a keeper once missed the drop because he'd gone to fetch oil. In San Juan, the signal crossed a busy office where an early lunch preserved local time in an unhelpful way. These stories are mild enough to be bedtime, and that is why they survive. The job of a time ball is to be almost always boring. We remember the exceptions because they make the boredom visible. Sailors kept their ritual with patience. You placed the chronometer on a steady table with a folded cloth underneath. You noted its rate from the last port. You waited for the preparatory hoist. You studied the sky for a gull that might wander directly in front of destiny. You listened for anyone counting aloud. It was common for a keeper or a boy with a trumpet to recite the last 10 seconds, an audio ladder for the falling sphere. When the ball touched bottom, you marked the dial and the seconds register, then built a small arithmetic. On Tuesday, it was plus 1.8 seconds per day. On Friday, it was plus 1.6. At sea, you would subtract accordingly, like offering a ship a regular cup of corrective tea. There is a romance to longitude, but this part is housekeeping. Housekeeping keeps romances alive. Back in the observatory, someone adjusted the master clock by stars. Astronomers peered through transit instruments at a precise wire in the eyepiece, waiting for a familiar star to drift across it. They tapped keys when it did, their taps shaping the daily truth for the harbor below. The wires that linked their truth to the ball also informed banks, newspapers, and any office that liked its day to begin on cue. At noon, a clerk could say, "Greenwich has happened," and feel his paperweight become official. Subtle analogy, it was a push notification with a view. Cities developed a light choreography around the drop. Men paused in the act of carrying crates. A baker looked up while dusting sugar. Office windows sprouted heads at predictable minutes. Children learned that noon had a body. It's difficult to imagine now, with phones that insist from pockets, that time once performed itself publicly like weather. If you missed the ball, you asked the fellow next to you, "Did she fall?" As if time were a dress and crossed a stage. "She did," he'd say, at the stroke. Then you both returned to occupying the afternoon dot when radio arrived. It spoke softly and then loudly. The first time signals transmitted by wireless in the early 1900s sounded like a polite metronome from nowhere, and ships at sea heard Greenwich for the first time without land's assistance. The Royal Observatory began airing its famous 6 pips in 1924, a brief parade of beeps marching into millions of kitchens on the hour. Within a decade, a captain no longer needed to see a harbor to have a conversation with it about precision. The balls, meanwhile, continued to drop because habits are hospitable. Sight is a pleasure even when hearing does the job. For decades, radio corrected the clock and the ball reassured the eye. The way you might check the stovetop even though you're certain you turned it off. Eventually, many balls retired to museums or postcards. Others kept working because people enjoyed dependable ceremonies. In Portsmouth, the ball at the dockyard still descends with veteran restraint. In Sydney, it falls at one precisely regulated tick later than noon, almost a wink in tourist stand. Beside locals who think of it as the city clearing its throat, Greenwich's ball remains, read as a sentence in a textbook, dropping with absolute lack of drama at 13 o'clock to assist Londoners who have eaten lunch. The continued existence of a device that turns gravity into a public service says something flattering about us. We like to witness agreement. If you examine one up close, you will find it is not mysterious. The sphere is ribbed wood or metal, sometimes canvas covered, designed to look large against a pale sky. The mast is a spar with a track. The winch is a winch. The release is a simple latch or an electromagnet, as mundane as a doorbell wearing a uniform. What impressed the 19th century was not complexity, but reliability. The keeper signed a log, signal given 12 hours OAMO south, fair, and then wound the mechanism for tomorrow. In such repetitions, a city discovers peace. The day acquired hinges at which its weight could rest for a second before swinging on. Time balls also exported a certain hush into language. Phrases like "on the ball" drifted, perhaps, from observatory masts to playgrounds, though etymology is a game without referees. Drop became a verb for triggering events in public, producing a seasonal rain of artificial apples, peaches, oranges, and fireworks-resistant spheres in town squares worldwide on New Year's Eve. That tradition markets itself loudly. Its ancestor worked quietly for sailors who preferred their holidays at sea to arrive where expected. It is pleasant to imagine the modern crowd's cheer being the echo of a captain's fate. Pencil tick in a logbook long gone to salt out the lesson of the ball. If we need one to hum ourselves to sleep, is that precision can be social. An observatory's best idea is not complete until it shakes hands with a dock. A chronometer's dignity improves when the city shares the second with it. The visible drop converts arithmetic into a moment, and the moment becomes memory because people thousands across a century looked up at the same time and saw the same very small event. In an age before quartz, before satellites, before a pocket buzzed at you like a determined bee, accuracy depended on collective attention, on everyone agreeing to glance at noon dot if you want to picture it tonight. Choose any harbor you like. The water barely moves. A cat sleeps on a bollard and dreams of fish too careful to participate. On the hill, the ball rests near the top of its mast, patient as a hell breath. A boy by the rail stops whistling. A captain polishes a smudge from the glass without looking away. The keeper watches the seconds with his hand on a small lever he has pulled 1,000 times. Habit smooths the last second until it glints. Somewhere a church bell begins to raise its voice because it believes it is helpful. Then the ball releases and slides down the track as steadily as a thought going back where it belongs. Pencils touch paper. A few hats are adjusted as if in applause. At once the harbor returns to its ordinary sound ropes against cleats, footsteps on stone. Gulls with the arrogance of gulls, and the big red truth waits. Quietly until tomorrow. The rest is mostly archived dust and kind anecdotes. A storm once ripped a ball loose and put it to sea like an unwilling buoy. Fishermen towed it home, that awkward famous sphere behind the small practical boat. A keeper built a tiny room at the base of his mast and used it to make tea while guarding against thieves, who had no use for time but recognized brass. An advertisement for corrected watches, checked by the drop, ran for years in the very same newspaper that printed the shipping forecast. And one ball, this is my favorite, was painted anew every spring. A red so red that small children reach toward it from their mother's arms, the way we reach for cherries we cannot have yet. After radio came quartz, and after quartz came GPS, and after GPS came phones that consult 3 satellites to answer the question, is it lunchtime? Ships sync their systems automatically. Airplanes negotiate decimals. Microwave ovens announce 0 o'clock because they've been unplugged, and we know, by reflex rather than ritual, how to fix them. Yet the time balls keep dropping in a handful of places, and that is helpful for the soul. It is clarity outdoors. It is the second made visible without commentary. It is a contraption that accepts the world's most predictable force and turns it into a favor. If you are drifting now, and I hope you are, you may let the mechanism run in your mind once more. The keeper winds the drum. The ball rises, rests, rises fully. Minutes pass with the indifferent pleasure of warm bread cooling. The telegraph trembles, or the quartz ticks, or the old observatory clock crosses its own line. Whichever it is, it speaks the same sentence without adjectives. The latch withdraws. The sphere descends, touches home, and becomes a round shadow among ordinary shadows. Pencils move. Tea is finished. The harbor exhales. And somewhere out at sea, hours later, a ship notes the sun and trusts a number that traveled from a hill to a deck, and then into the gentle arithmetic of a map. That is all. That is enough. You might not expect the quietest room in France to hold court over every kitchen scale, shipping invoice, and airport luggage counter on Earth, but it did, and in a very tidy way. In a basement near Paris, under nested glass bells that looked like a set of increasingly confident cloches, a small cylinder of platinum iridium sat on a velvet pad and pretended to be a planet. It did not sparkle. It did not do tricks. It simply embodied exactly 1 kilogram, which is a surprising amount of authority for an object that could, in theory, be misplaced behind a jar of jam. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you may subscribe to whatever calm you find here. If not, I'll let the gram follow you into sleep at a rate of 1,000 per kilogram, more or less. The cylinder is about the height of 2 stacked Oreos without the cream, though that comparison would have upset many committees. You do not touch it. You do not breathe on it. You consider its bell jars the way you consider a sleeping cat. The cat is in charge. The kilogram is as well. The metal was a sensible alloy, 90% platinum for noble dignity, 10% iridium for temper. The cylinder's edges were slightly rounded, not from arrogance, but to avoid losing atoms to careless corners. It had 3 names, one for ceremony, one for records, and one for people who worked with it too often to bother with the long form. Officially, the International Prototype Kilogram. On forums, IPK. Privately, among those who dealt with lint professionally, it was the Big K, which is a deeply human thing to name an object that cannot hear. The Big K rested at the Bureau International des Poids et Mesures in Sevres, a place with good hedges and many keys. Each morning, somewhere as dull as a ledger, someone checked the temperature and the barometer and the list of people allowed to be near the bells. It read like a polite heist movie with no heist. A tripod with a glass dome, then a second, then a third. The laboratory air was filtered until it was more idea than atmosphere. The cylinder sat, heavy and blameless. Around the world lived its siblings, national prototypes, also cylinders, also cautious. Each had a number and a passport, and a temperament that, by design, matched the parent as closely as the metallurgical arts could arrange. They lived in vaults in Berlin, London, Washington, Tokyo, and so on, each in a fort accompanied by a notebook and a person who disliked crumbs. When the time came, which was every few decades, the siblings traveled to Sevres in padded cases, always insultingly light compared to their content, to be compared. The word in official minutes was verification, but in practice, it felt like a reunion for objects that do not mingle. The ritual of comparison was slow enough to make tea between verbs. First, clean the masses. The technicians wore soft gloves, then softer ones, and a mood usually reserved for dusting a crown. Cleaning was done with something called chamois and something else called ether, and a technique note this micro-hook named after a man who perfected wiping. It is hard to think of a more bureaucratically triumphant sentence than we adopted the boredom method of wiping, but the history of measurement is full of them. After cleaning, you wait. The masses must rest to shed the insult of fingerprints and the gift of water molecules. Moisture is an extrovert. It clings. The kilogram needed to return to an agreeable loneliness before being weighed. The scales were not like grocery scales. They were double pan balances hidden inside glass boxes, with knives and agate bearings and a tolerance that blurred into philosophy. You placed the prototype in one pan, its challenger in the other, and watched the pointer as if it were a timid animal deciding whether to cross a stream. If the pointer hesitated on 0, you had done well. If it drifted a hair, you made a note and then a smaller note explaining the first note. You repeated this with the masses swapped, and again, rotating like a group of well-behaved planets in a classroom model. Temperature corrections were applied because metals changed their opinions as they warm. Air buoyancy corrections were applied because kilograms in vacuum and kilograms in air have different social lives. At the end came a number, a small one, expressed as micrograms, which felt like gossip at the scale of dust dot the kilogram had admirers you might not expect. Pharmacists who deal in powders that remember everything. Jewelers who are suspicious of conversion factors. Postal clerks who like their parcels to behave. Scientists adored it less for the cylinder itself than for the idea that mass could be anchored, that an entire field could write, "This is what we mean," and point to a thing. The Big K was a museum piece that remained in use. It was a teacher who did not retire. Students learned to think of 1 kilogram as an object under glass as much as an amount. Ask a classroom of children to draw a kilogram and they make a circle with bell jars. Ask the same children to draw a meter and they make a line. One is length, which we love to sketch. One is mass, which we prefer to cradle. In the 19th century, choosing platinum iridium was the honest compromise of people trying to be boring forever. Platinum resists even the moodier acids. Iridium adds spine. Compare it to a brass weight in a kitchen drawer, which tarnishes when a woman thinks too loudly. Even so, the Big K lived in a place where dust had to show identification at the door. The keepers learned the quirks of tiny things: cloth fibers that pretend to be mass, oils that immigrate from fingertips, the slow romance between air and metal. One report described a technician who, after wiping a standard, waited for the last uncooperative molecule to decide that its home was the lab and not the cylinder. The report did not name the molecule. That is the tone of the kilogram century, patient, unruffled, mildly amused by atoms. There were, of course, other kilograms, everyday ones. Market weights that had been bumped against a scale so many times their edges turned shy. School masses with tiny hooks for string, arranged in boxes that smelled like varnish and arithmetic. Cast iron discs whose numbers had been painted by someone with a very careful wrist. These had their lives, and for them the Big K was rumor. They knew only the national prototypes, and sometimes not even those. They lived with the knowledge that, once in a while, a person with very clean hands would bring a better weight and stare at them until they confessed. Meanwhile, Severs remained Severs. Gardens outside, ultramarine air inside, the bell jars sitting like three transparent opinions, one atop another. The Big K's keeper spoke politely about drift. Not because the cylinder-wandered metals do not walk, but because mass is a social experience. If the Big K is the definition, it cannot be said to change. It is the world that would be changing, which is an awkward sentence and made for awkward meetings. Over the decades, during comparisons, the siblings whispered a pattern. They were, as a group, heavier than before relative to their parent. Or the parent had grown lighter relative to the group. Or hydrogen had made friends where it shouldn't. Or someone had been too enthusiastic with a cloth 50 years ago. Each explanation sat down and folded its hands. None stood up completely. Small differences, tens of micrograms, human breath at the scale of list trouble people who depend on sameness. Consider the chemist who builds a reputation on reagents that behave, the physicist constructing comparisons that reach across centuries, the oceanographer weighing water samples until the sea agrees to talk. They need the kilogram to be a stillness they can lean on without looking. The Big K obliged most days, but the whisper of drift worked like a draft under a door. The room is warm enough, yet you think, without wanting to, about a cardigan. Engineers began to court the idea that mass should be defined not by an object, but by a constant. The way the meter had divorced itself from platinum decades earlier and married light. This is not romance, but practicality. Objects cultivate stories. Constants endure politely. The Planck constant H was proposed as a suitor, a very small number with very large consequences, connecting energy to frequency in a way that is both austere and reassuring. If we could build a device that balanced electrical power against mechanical power with obscene accuracy, then mass could be written as math. The device arrived with a name that sounds like it helps children cross the street, the Watt Balance. Later, in a burst of clarity, it was renamed the Kibble Balance after the man who made it credible, which is a rare case of eponymous honesty arriving on time. A Kibble Balance looks like it escaped from a thoughtful clock. Coils, magnets, a beam, a moving stage, a set of lasers to measure movement so gently that the air itself feels overbearing. In one mode, the coil moves through a magnetic field and generates a voltage. In another, the coil holds still, and the current generates a force that balances the mass. The ratio of electrical power to mechanical power is tied to the Planck constant and other constants with names that sound like a syllabus Josephson von Klitzing. The more carefully you build the balance, the better you can declare that 1 kilogram is whatever amount of mass makes those two powers equal when the equations say they should be. You do this in vacuum, at a temperature carefully chosen, with vibration damped until the building forgets it's on Earth. The Watt Balance community, let us enjoy that phrase, worked for years. They worried about alignment and fringing fields, and laser wavelengths refusing to pick a lane. They argued in memoranda that read like lullabies of caution. They published differences between their experiments in parts per billion, which is a gentle number you can imagine dripped into a glass with a pipette while someone hums. They built and rebuilt. Meanwhile, the Silicon Sphere project tried a different route. Count atoms in a sphere so round that, if it were the size of the Earth, mountains would be less than a few meters high. Both efforts shared a personality, stubborn, methodical, and a little shy about adjectives. While the constants were being courted, the Big K continued its quiet schedule. The bell jars were lifted for visitors only in the mind. In the lab, they were lifted according to steps that sounded like choreography. Left, pause, right, breathe, not too close. Someone dusted the glass. Someone checked the logs. Someone wrote a careful 0 in a log. A visiting dignitary looked through a window and nodded, as if any of this could be judged from a glance. The staff appreciated visitors in the way librarians appreciate people who like the smell of books. Appreciation with boundaries. There were anecdotes, unexcited ones. A technician forgot a pen while descending to the vault and decided, on principle, to do without rather than walk back upstairs and break the rhythm. A new bell jar arrived from a glassblower who included an apology note for a bubble that did not exist, because people who work with accuracy long enough acquire manners even when not necessary. A mouse once found the outer corridor interesting and was removed with ceremony appropriate to a small monarch. None of this changed the cylinder. The cylinder remained a cylinder, which is a success. When the kilogram finally moved from artifact to constant in 2018, the ceremony felt like replacing a reliable, slightly eccentric school teacher with a very polished online course that never forgets anything and answers questions with the same sentence each time. You may certainly miss the old teacher. You may also appreciate the homework being, at last, exactly the same for everyone. The definition, the kilogram, is defined by taking the fixed numerical value of the Planck constant. H is a piece of poetry if you are in the mood for it. It freed the world from guarding a cylinder. It also gave the cylinder a new job. No longer the definition, it became a student of the definition, a mass like any other, useful for checking instruments and for reminding us what devotion to sameness looks like when it wears velvet. After the change, the Big K did not sulk. It continued to exist on its velvet stage, visited by people who enjoy the idea that order can be arranged in bell-shaped glass. Kibble balances hummed. Silicon spheres took their bath in ultra-pure water and posed for interferometers. Laboratories discussed alignment as if it were a character trait. In the outside world, nothing changed dramatically. Your kitchen scale still complains at the same amounts of flour. Baggage fees continue their complicated relationship with fairness. A pharmacist measures a powder and stays within the small mercy of allowed error. Somewhere a high school box of masses still contains a 100-gram hanger that is actually 99.86, and an exam remains unaffected. There is a pleasant irony in the fact that the kilogram became pure idea just when we are surrounded by objects that pretend to be ethereal. Phones weigh more than their advertising. Cloud storage lives in warehouses the size of afternoons, and yet our measurements stepped away from a thing and into math. The constants are calm companions. They do not drift. They do not complain about dust. They request only patience and equipment that acts like patience wearing metal. But we still like things. In a museum, a child stands on tiptoe to see the replica under glass and asks, with the direct logic of small people, "Is that the real kilogram?" The guide answers truthfully, "It used to define the real one. Now it remembers." Perhaps the child nods, which is how acceptance looks when you are new to compromise. Perhaps the child wonders how much a cloud weighs and then a sandwich. This is the social life of mass, continuing without drama. You can replay the old ritual in your head if it helps you sleep. A quiet room. The sound of air being a little cleaner than usual. The soft clap of a glove. A bell jar lifted with 2 hands. The way you lift a cake you do not trust. A small cylinder revealed, not gleaming, not even trying. A technician derives comfort from the way the things that matter are ordinary in shape. There is a balance. There's a notebook with margin lines you could park a bicycle on. Numbers accumulate. Corrections are applied with kindness. A door clicks, pleasantly official. In another building, a different team checks alignment and wavelength and reads the same number from a different source. The 2 truths agree like neighbors, and the day settles around that agreement. Around the cylinder, history leaves a thin film of affection. The French Revolution wanted rational measures and got them more or less. The metric system grew up and found itself invited everywhere, sometimes reluctantly. Nations stamped kilogram into iron and brass the way you might sign your name when learning handwriting. The kilogram under glass gave all of that an anchor. In the same century, when railways decided when noon happened and time became a shared habit, mass became a shared habit too. Agreements are the most practical kind of romance. If you're still awake and either answer is correct, you might think about how the big K, no longer the law, enjoys being part of the citizenry of objects. It waits at Sivers with the famous patience of inanimate things. The gardens outside practice green. The air filters hum. Someone oils a hinge. Someone's pen works the first time, a small grace. Someone leaves their bicycle with exactly 1 kilogram of stubborn chain attached to the fence. Somewhere else, a kibble balance performs its quiet circus of forces and voltages, while a graph draws a line that proves the world can keep a promise to itself. In laboratories that look like very clean kitchens, powders become solutions, solutions become numbers, and numbers become papers whose conclusions are less dramatic than definite. We end, if ending is the word, where we began, with a modest cylinder and a modest room, behaving as if importance were simply a matter of showing up every day and being the same shape. The bell jars are replaced, the lights click off politely. The door locks with a sound as satisfying as an answer key. Above ground, buses sigh and groceries are weighed, and the world continues to prefer that a kilogram be a kilogram, whether or not anyone is watching. You may let that preference rock you a little. It is dependable. It is slow. It does not require applause. And like many things designed to keep you safe from uncertainty, it whispers without need to raise its voice.